All right, welcome to the last chapter of AP Econ, chapter 26. So let's get to it. So first, you kind of already should know this, but just a quick little review. Wage rate. It's the price paid per unit of labor services per hour. You should already know this just because it kind of makes sense, not necessarily because we've covered it. So this includes salary, your bonus. This includes commission you might make from selling products as a salesperson. This might include royalties. This might include paid vacation. This might include your health insurance. These your pension. These are all things that are factored into your wage rate. And so, anyways, it's a price per unit of labor services per hour. Now, labor earnings is the hours worked times the number, the hourly wage rate equals the labor earnings. So again, you would know what this is. Maybe you haven't heard of labor earnings before, but you understand this concept. So now, nominal wage versus real wage. We've kind of talked about nominal GDP versus real GDP, and so it's the same formula for calculating real wage as in nominal wage, or I should say similar formula. So again, the nominal wage is the money you receive per hour, but then the real wage is how much stuff you can actually buy with that wage. So for example, right now, we might have a high nominal wage, but because of inflation, it's actually a really low wage, a real wage, because inflation supposedly might go crazy with all the government spending right now, being that it's one of the largest stimuluses ever that the government is spending because of our coronavirus depression we're in. And so what's the formula for finding real wage or real GDP? Or quick refresher, I'm going to put the formula sheet on Canvas today for both the micro formulas and the macro and micro formulas. And so a quick review of the macro formula sheet where this is. It's also a micro formula for the wages, but here it is real quick. So if you look under the macro formula sheet, just above the unemployment related stuff, you'll see real value. There's two real value formulas. It could be real value of GDP, it could be real value of wages. But if you're trying to find the real value of wages and you have the nominal value of wages divided by the price index, the CPI, then you can find the real value. Or if you have the nominal value rate percent, so it grew by, your wage grew by 2%, but inflation was 5%, then 2 minus the 5 would equal a real value of -3. You've actually lost value. You can buy less stuff with that example, right? And so, so you might have to calculate real value using either of these. Of course, the GDP, it could be the real GDP, it'd be the GDP divided by the price index. In this case, it would be the GDP deflator because it has it's a similar price index, but just different. We've talked about that in the past. And that index is called the GDP deflator. So that's the only difference. But anyways, so continuing back to chapter 26. All right. So let's talk about now just like there's perfect competition, monopolistic competition, oligopoly, and monopolies. Just like there's a spectrum for those markets, there's also a spectrum for the labor market. And there's a purely competitive labor market, and there's the monopsony labor market. And so this is on the one side of the spectrum. And so if you notice here, we've got the market, standard supply, standard demand. It's the sum of all the marginal revenue products, and the supply would be your sum of your marginal resource costs. And so we have in this market 1,000 quantity of labor. In this case, it's going to be labor of carpenters hired, and the wage is $10 an hour. Now, for the firm, they're hiring 5 because where the $10 is, that's their their supply, and if you notice, their supply is completely horizontal. That's also their MRC curve. And so because the MRC or the supply curve intersects the demand, also known as the MRP curve, at 5, that's how many workers they hire. So the question at the bottom of the screen says, how many firms are in this market? And it's a purely competitive labor market. The answer is, well, you take 1,000, divide by 5, and you should get 200. So 200 firms, exactly the same, hiring 5 workers, are in this market. And of course, they would like to pay the workers less so they could have more profit, because if they're paying their workers less, there's less costs for them and more than revenue, right? More profit. And so they'd like to pay them less, but if they decide to pay their workers $9 an hour, what are the carpenters going to do? They're going to say, there's 200 other people I could go get a job at. I'm done with you. I'm going somewhere else. I'm going to get paid more over there. And so you wouldn't be able to get any workers, and you'd go out of business. And so, so they are wage takers. They're not wage makers. And if you'd like to practice some, understanding these graphs some more, go on page 509. There's a practice quiz with a key on it. And normally I would assign homework study questions 4, 6, and 7 for chapter 26. So feel free to look at that if you'd like to. And so again, this is very similar to the perfect competition firm graph. Remember, it's the completely horizontal marginal revenue, price, and demand. Sometimes I like to call it the Mr. DARP curve, because it's Mr. marginal revenue, DARP, D stands for demand, ARP is average revenue, so it's also the average revenue curve, and it's also the price, so Mr. DARP. So if you notice, in a perfect competition graph, the demand line is completely horizontal. But what's unique about this one, in the labor market or the resource market, in perfect competition, it's a supply that's completely horizontal. So it's kind of opposite in this case. So similar, because there is a market again with demand and supply that comes across to the firm, but different in that instead of it being the demand line, here it's the supply line. Okay, so now on the other spectrum, there's the monopsony. The other part of the labor market is the monopsony. And it's a single buyer, so that the only person hiring this specific type of labor is immobile geographically. So currently I could go get a job in Platteville, Wisconsin, or Dubuque, right? And so technically, the Dubuque School District is not a monopsony over teachers per se, because we're not immobile. Although you could kind of say they have some degree of monopsony power, because in general, there is some relative immobility geographically. So anyways, so monopsony would be where, like, maybe you're out in the middle of the cornfield, Iowa, and no one else can, wants to really travel that far. Then, in a sense, you might have a monopsony for a school district out in the middle of a lonely county in Iowa. Now, of course, anywhere, it could be anywhere in the world. I gave Iowa as an example. Of course, a monopsony is also a wage maker. They get to make the wages because, hey, people, if they want a job, they have to take the wage that this company is going to provide them. But, see, there's a but there, but the more it employs, so if they hire more and more workers, they have to pay a higher and higher wage to encourage more people to come and work for them. So if it's a small town and they want more and more people to work for them, they're going to have to pay higher and higher wages to get people to stop working at some other company and come work at their company. Or they have to get that one, high school bum off the couch to come work for them. So the only way they're going to get him off the couch is to pay a higher wage. And so in that sense, they're not entirely wage maker, because they do potentially, if they want to have more output, if they want to hire more labor, they have to increase the wage. So that's a monopsony. Now let's talk about some examples of what a monopsony is. So there are nurses in some places. Of course, in Dubuque, is there really a monopsony over nurses? No, there's 2 different hospitals and lots of different clinics. So in a small town, maybe nurses might be, there might be a monopsony over the nurses, a laborer, but not in Dubuque. The NFL was a good example, but then what happened? Well, the XFL just happened. And so if you want to do professional football, the NFL no longer has a monopsony over professional football players. The XFL might also hire you now. And of course, if you want to be a teacher, as I mentioned earlier, there might be a monopsony in some places for licensed teachers. If you want to be a sniper, well, guess what? Probably only one legal place that's hiring for that, and that is the military. Of course, there's lots of big factories in small towns, and those would be examples of monopsonies. So like a paper mill in upper Michigan, where my wife's family is from, or a coal factory in a small town somewhere. Some other examples might be shipbuilders. There's some places like in close to upper peninsula, Minnesota, and it's in the Green Bay area. There's a place where they build boats. Of course, I know this because I like boats, right? So if you want to be a boat manufacturer, if you're a boat guy who builds boats, well, that's the only place you're going to get hired is from that one company, Lockheed Martin in this case. And so that'd be another example, maybe a monopsony. So anyways, there's lots of examples of monopsonies, but most of them are local examples. So now what does the monopsony graph look like? Well, here it is. But so here is the monopsony graph, and let's break it down. So a monopsony, let me ask this question. Do they want a high wage? Do they want to pay their workers up here? Do they want to pay a low wage down here? The answer is they want to pay a low wage. And again, because they're a monopsony, right? They can get away with it. They can get away with paying them a low wage. So how do they figure out how much to employ? Well, they go to where the MRC curve intersects the MRP curve, sort of like where the marginal revenue and the marginal cost curve intersect. And instead of going up, they go down to the supply curve. And from that point, that's going to be the wage, the monopsony wage. And if they go down all the way, that's going to be the quantity of labor they're going to hire. And so that would be your monopsony wage. Where the supply curve intersects the demand curve would be what we'd call what society wants, the allocatively efficient point. And so anyways, so that's where supply intersects the demand curve, also known as the MRP curve. And so this should sound familiar to the monopoly curve, right? The monopoly curve, again, you've got marginal revenue, marginal cost, and you go up to the demand line and go across to figure out the price that the monopoly is going to charge for its products. And of course, you go down from where the marginal revenue and marginal cost intersect to find how many outputs they're going to make, right? So very similar. One, you're going up to demand. The other one, you're going down to supply. And so I like to call it the monopoly curves. Wait, sorry. Monopoly, monopsony. Yeah, that's what it is. So, gotta get your gang signals right. So monopsony is up, monopoly is down. So anyways, work on your gang symbols so you know the graphs. And I'll test you more hopefully as we go along. So why though if you noticed, the marginal resource cost curve is no longer the same as the supply curve for the monopsony. So why is the marginal resource cost curve going up to the left? Why is it above the supply curve? Well, here's your reason why. You might start off with 0 units of labor because you don't have a high enough of a wage. Let's say you raise the wage to $6. Now you're going to hire one worker. And now your total labor cost went from 0 to 6. So your marginal resource cost, the change was $6. As you add more and more workers, your wage rate has to increase. Whereas with, let me ask a question. What would, yeah, you have to increase your wage rate because you're a monopsony, because you're drawing from a smaller and smaller pool of workers. In a purely competitive labor market, the marginal resource curve, what would it happen? Would it go up like the monopsony? No. You're in the marginal, sorry, the marginal resource cost would be completely horizontal for your perfectly competitive labor market, not so with your monopsony market. All right, so this is a formula I've shown you last chapter for finding the profit maximizing position and least cost all combined. So where the marginal revenue product of labor divided by the price of labor is equal to the MRP of capital divided by the price of capital, where it's equal to 1, that is your least cost and your profit maximizing position for the perfectly competitive market. And of course, it's kind of a combination of the least cost rule. So that's your least cost rule. But now we're moving away from the perfectly competitive market to what about an imperfectly competitive market? What about a monopsony? Well, how do you find the profit maximizing point there? Well, you have this formula. So if you were trying to figure out how much labor versus capital, how many units do I hire? Well, it's the marginal revenue product of labor divided by the marginal resource cost of labor, whereas before it was the price of labor. Now we're dealing with the marginal resource cost of labor or the marginal resource cost of capital. And that's because no longer is your price of your labor the same as your marginal resource cost. It's only the same in your perfectly competitive market. So anyway, so it's a very similar formula. You may or may not see it this year because of the FRQ format. Either way, this is on the formula sheet for the microeconomics. So now let's talk about unions. Unions have a way of helping bring up the wages, right? That's what they're about, bringing in more stacks of cash. That's their number one goal, is to raise wage rates. And yes, they are about bringing more safety to a workplace, but their number one goal is increasing the wage rates. So how do they do it? Well, they're trying to increase demand in some cases. So they might increase product demand, they might increase productivity, they might alter the price of other inputs, all to raise demand, therefore bringing up the wage of the workers. So here's some examples. There might be and I'll post this ad on Canvas, but there might be advertising that might pay for so that people will buy, in this case, more rides with Union Cab. They might lobby for a stadium to be built or a high-speed rail to be built, because if that's the case, then more workers are going to be hired, and there's going to be more demand for those workers, raising their wages. So they might lobby for big projects, which also might involve higher taxation because that's how they're going to pay for it. They might go and lobby for teachers for the government, talk about the importance of teaching and education. They might, if they're working on getting certain people hired, like space engineers or something like that, they might argue for the importance of exploring space and things like that. So again, these are some examples how they might increase product demand. Some other ways they might increase product demand is improving the productivity. Of course, one of the ways in which you improve productivity is you improve the capital that is complementary to labor. And so there's been a growing tendency among companies to try and have the boss meet with the labor management to try and work on productivity. So the workers plus the management working together to come up with plans to make more productivity. And of course, unions really like these committees because it hopefully boosts demand for their workers. An example at Dubuque Senior High School might be the site council. It's the students plus the teachers plus the parents all coming together trying to come up with ways to make the school better. Some other ways in which they might improve demand is it might increase price for substitutes. Because, for example, if they raise minimum wage and they're, you have to have a certain associate's degree or some sort of some other certification to work. If they raise the wage for minimum wage, then it makes it more difficult for and less incentive for the company to say, "Oh, we'll hire any old Joe," because they don't want to hire any old Joe because any old Joe is going to actually cost them a lot more money. And so it's not worth to train any old Joe because then they already are going to pay them a lot more once they get certification. So increasing the price of a substitute, like increasing minimum wage, might also be able to improve demand for their specific labor. Now, they also could reduce prices of complementary resources. So they might try and reduce the price of computers. If they can reduce the price of computers, then if computers are cheap, then they can buy a bunch of computers, and also they need people to run those computers, and so there's more demand for the workers. They might try and get the raw materials cheaper. They might try and get rid of a tariff, and then that way the raw materials can come into the country cheaper, and then there's more demand for labor to work with that raw material to make the product. There's a lot of Teamsters, trucker unions, and so they might fight for lower costs of things like electric trucks, because then if there's lower costs for the electric trucks, they'll buy more trucks, and with more trucks, they'll buy more workers, right? So some other ways in which they might try to affect the price for substitutes or complements to try and improve demand for their labor. So again, that's a demand enhancement model. But most unions don't focus on demand, they focus more on supply. In the past, they were specifically known for restricting immigration, reducing child labor. They encouraged compulsory retirement. They enforced a shorter work week, and they might argue like, "Oh, this is purely humanitarian. It's all about making people's lives safer," and maybe there was some legitimacy to that, but it also means there's less people working, therefore making or allowed to work. Less people are allowed to work, which then increases the demand for more workers to be hired, or the same workers to be hired but at higher wages. And so anyway, so this is the most classic thing they do is they try and lower supply. However, their ability to lower supply is legally different depending on the state you're in. And so exclusive unionism or a craft union is what the textbook calls it. Although if you look in the news today, it's actually called closed shop or union shops. And what they try and do is they force you to have to join a union if you want to work in that specific industry. So I have a friend who works as an elevator operator. He fixes elevators, and so he had to have an apprenticeship. And the only way you could be an elevator operator is if you were part of the elevator operator union. I don't know the name of it. It's a special name because I don't think it's just elevator operators. But that's an example of a craft union or a closed shop union or a union shop. There's lots of different ways of saying it. By the way, they're lowering the supply. Um, they might lower the supply also by not only having long apprenticeships where you have to meet certain qualifications, they might have very high initiation fees. So it's a wall you have to jump over that might be difficult for some people. And they limit the number of new members admitted. So there might be a lot of people who want to be a new electrician, but the union says, nope, we only allow 100 people a year to our union. And so that means the supply less, therefore wages higher, right? And so that's called exclusive union, but it's illegal in a lot of states, and they call it right to work states. And so they're forced to now have more agency shops or open shops. And so agency shops are something that Wisconsin used to be. If I wanted to be a teacher in Wisconsin back in the day, I could choose not to be in the union, but I still had to pay union dues. And so the union would then argue for the teachers' salaries. And so they didn't necessarily limit the supply, but they still had a lot of money power. In Iowa, we have an open shop, and I don't, as a teacher in Iowa, I do not have to be part of the union, and nor do I have to pay union dues. And so they cannot limit the supply of teachers in Iowa for that reason. Therefore, their power to negotiate wages is a lot less in Iowa. So if though the unions are able to do a closed shop, union shop, or exclusive or craft union, they can lower supply. And again, that's going to raise wages from a competitive market, WC, to a WU, a wage from the union. Of course, that brings down the quantity of labor hired. Now, when it comes to licensing and ways they might limit things, can you think of some examples of ways that they might lower, or some licenses exist that might make it more difficult to be a part of a certain profession? Well, here's some examples. Barbers, teachers, doctors, lawyers, and believe it or not, egg graders. To work in grading eggs, I never knew this, you have to have a license to do so. And there's tons of other examples of licensing boards that are out there that limit the supply of people who are in that market. Now, an inclusive union would be one in which, like Iowa, where they cannot lower supply, but they can still argue for a higher wage potentially. And so they might, for example, say in Iowa, they might say, hey, okay, School District of Dubuque, you're going to pay your workers more or else we strike. And technically in Iowa, I think it's illegal for us to strike. But we could try and argue certain things. Maybe we don't care, we'll break the law anyways. Either way, they can argue, they can negotiate with the district for higher wages. And if they do that, they go from, again, the competitive wage market to a higher wage. But this time, in a sense, our supply curve, even though technically it's down here, it basically ends up being a price floor for a moment. And so it intersects the demand curve here. So there is what we call a surplus of workers who are willing to work but can't because of the union hired wages. And so it's sort of like a minimum wage law. It acts like a minimum wage law. And so again, there's reduced workers reduced workers being hired. There's actually a lot more workers able to be to work, but there's only so many hired. So that's an example of an inclusive union. So now, what happens when you have a monopsony run into a union? Because if we think about it, and let's call it an inclusive union, because that's the most common type of union you might see. the union wants higher wages, the monopsony wants lower wages. And so again, we're marginal resource cost intersects marginal revenue product. We go down, that's the quantity that they want to hire, the monopsony does, and they want to hire them at this monopsony wage rate. The union wants to argue for a higher price. So what ends up being the case? Do they settle at the union wage or the monopsony wage? Or do they potentially settle for something like the competitive market wage? So when you have a monopsony partner with a union, you end up sometimes having closer to a competitive wage. We don't necessarily know, because it does depend on how strong the union is or how strong the monopsony is. Because maybe it might be more towards a union or more towards a monopsony. We don't really know for sure. So there is no solid answer for sure as to how much they get hired. It just depends on the negotiations. And some places where that happens is Boeing, who manufactures airplanes, they're known for having unions, and they are known for being a monopsony, and that they're the only one of the only places in America that hire for aircraft engineers, things like that. So there you go. You've now been introduced to all the graphs you should have seen for microeconomics this year. If you have questions, please feel free to ask. Peace for now.